Let's be clear. You're a system, and the most critical piece of data that system runs on, your perception of yourself, is corrupt.
This number? It's the correlation between how smart you think you are and your actual objectively measured IQ. And this isn't from a small study. This comes from a meta-analysis of over 36,000 participants.
So what that means in the real world is that your own opinion of your intelligence explains less than 10% of the actual variance. Let that sink in. Your internal model is functionally broken.
So if your own assessment is only 10% of the picture, what's calculating the other 90? The answer to that question reveals the entire architecture of how you are truly seen. And that's the only version that really matters.
Now, this isn't about you being uniquely bad at this. This isn't a personal failing. It is a predictable, systemic error, a baked-in bug in our cognitive hardware. And it has very real, very severe consequences. Because that 90% you can't see, that's the variable that dictates your market value. So understanding the system that calculates it isn't some feel-good self-help project. It's a survival requirement. At its core, the problem is a data asymmetry. You and the outside world are running your analyses on two completely different, non-overlapping datasets. You judge yourself on your internal world, your intentions, your private anxieties, how fast you feel like you're thinking. The world, on the other hand, only sees the external data, your actual behavior, the words you use, the things you produce. And the kicker is, those two datasets are not correlated.
And this knowledge gap isn't random. It's governed by a formal model that predicts, with surprising accuracy, who has the informational advantage for any given trait.
It's called the Self-Other Knowledge Asymmetry Model, or SOCA, and it's pretty straightforward. For traits that are internal and don't have a lot of social value, like your level of anxiety, you're the expert, you've got privileged access. But for the traits society really judges, things like intelligence, creativity, attractiveness, your own perception is completely crippled by motivational blind spots. Your desire to protect your ego makes your self-assessment worthless. For these traits, the math shows that peer judgment is simply more accurate.
Okay, so the logical next step seems simple, right? Just ask people what they think and average it out. But this is where we hit our next paradox. Any single piece of feedback you get is, statistically speaking, just noise.
The social relations model shows us why. It breaks down any one person's judgment of you into three parts. First, the perceiver effect. That's just the judge's inherent bias, how they tend to see everyone. Then there's the relationship effect, the unique dynamic between the two of you. The only part that's the real signal is the target effect. That's the consensus view. And confusing a single data point with that true signal is a catastrophic error. And digging that signal out of the noise is much harder for some traits than others. Consensus, what we call target variance, forms pretty easily for things you can observe, like leadership. That accounts for about 40% of the judgment. But for something more nebulous, like general personality, the real signal gets completely drowned out by the noise of individual biases and relationships.
So this sets up our next crisis. You need a broad consensus to find the true signal. But what happens if the entire network is structurally incentivized to give you distorted feedback?
Because this system isn't optimizing for truth, it's running on pure game theory. The people giving you feedback aren't trying to give you objective data. They're optimizing for their own social safety and status within the network.
The result is a social equilibrium where polite, inaccurate, and therefore useless data becomes the norm. Everyone engages in pooling behavior, giving normalized, artificially positive feedback to avoid social friction. The network itself actively conspires to keep you in the dark. But let's say you could somehow bypass all of that and get perfectly honest, aggregated feedback. There is still one final barrier, and this one is inside your own head. Your brain is hardwired to reject it.
We have powerful psychological defense mechanisms. The drive to maintain a stable identity and to see yourself positively means that any ego-threatening information gets put under a microscope. Your brain goes into hypercritical mode, looking for any flaw, any reason at all to discard that data as invalid. In this game, your own biology is your greatest adversary.
And you can't just power through this. There is a hard neurological limit to how much negative data your system can handle. Pushing past that threshold doesn't improve your calibration. It triggers a primal threat response. Your amygdala lights up, and it degrades the very executive function you need to process the feedback and correct your course.
All of this means there is a precise mathematical breaking point, a point where the gap between your internal model and external reality becomes so wide that the system just collapses.
And we know the number. That threshold is a sustained discrepancy of 1.5 standard deviations. When the gap between your internal self-model and objective reality hits that mark, catastrophic failure isn't just a risk, it's an inevitability.
In an academic setting, this failure can manifest as a learning disability diagnosis. In psychiatry, it can be a depressive collapse or body dysmorphia. At the most fundamental sensory level, it can be psychosis, a state where your brain's pre-existing beliefs completely override the evidence from your senses. The very adaptive bias that evolved for social competition becomes a clinical pathology.
This systemic flaw in our hardware is not a secret. The market is already adapting, which leads to a terminal prediction. By 2030, a majority of Fortune 500 companies will abandon self-assessment and performance reviews, citing a greater than 0.8 correlation between overrating and involuntary turnover.